It's the weekend, and you and your friends have plans to go to the beach. This means a few things: good food, drinks, sand, and of course, sweet, sweet sun. But when you arrive, it starts raining heavily. Plans are ruined, but don't worry. You can wait for it to pass. But what if it keeps raining and raining, and, you guessed it, raining more, say, for 1,000 years? 1,000 years sounds kind of sad. Well, at this point, I doubt you're still waiting. And if you were, I tell you it could be a long way off. Because 1,000 years of rain is actually very little compared to what happened about 234 million years ago. Back then, one day it started raining, and then didn't stop for almost 2 million years. This was the Carnian pluvial episode, as its name indicates. This event in history took place during the Carnian, one of the 6 stages that make up the Triassic, and it is the first stage of its late part overall. It is considered a fairly normal and quiet stage as far as the Triassic goes. That's not saying much, given the overall extravagance of this period. At that time, most of the world's land was still united in the huge supercontinent Pangaea. Pangaea covered more than it, tree of the planet's surface, while the superocean Panthalassa and the smaller Paleotethys dominated the rest of the globe. In terms of weather and climate, things were Triassic as usual. Lots of heat and aridity that made many areas pure desert or rock. There were very marked wet seasons that could not be ignored. Well, the extreme distribution between land and sea gave rise to something called megamonsoons, which, as you can imagine, were monsoons. They were absolutely overloaded, much more intense than today's. This, together with the generally miserable climate, made large areas of the interior of Pangaea, those closest to the equator, uninhabitable for most terrestrial life. This problem with the interiors was further aggravated by the presence of the central mountains of Pangaea. They rose near the center of the huge landmass and essentially split it in two, resulting in a clear north and south. These mountains were not only wide, but also extremely tall, which made them cast enormous rain shadows. They left some areas even drier, and also influenced the megamonsoons, making them a bit more unpredictable. Without a doubt, this was a chaotic phase for Mother Nature, and yet life managed to move forward, especially along the coasts and southern regions where the climate was more moderate. In fact, life during the Carnian was able to accelerate quite a bit, and things were starting to get interesting. Part of this is because the Great Dying had occurred before the Triassic and had been so severe that the recovery of life was still ongoing, so new things were always appearing left and right, including a group you've surely heard of, the dinosaurs. Yes, it was in this relatively unknown time that the most famous prehistoric group of animals first emerged, or at least the first unquestionably true dinosaurs. Our knowledge of these pioneers comes mainly from the Santa Maria Formation, a site from Pangaean Brazil composed of semi-arid lands with scattered forests and an occasional river. If you traveled back in time to here, you would find inside a novel creature, the Sauricosaurus, a Herrerasaurid too, 25 meters long, one of the largest dinosaurs of the time, although that's not saying much, since it only needed to weigh as much as a medium-sized dog to boast that achievement, and that smaller size compared to its later relatives limited its diet to vertebrates, small and medium-sized like cynodonts, rhynchosaurs, and various synapsids. It was a rare dinosaur but normal in Santa Maria. Since things get stranger when we look at the only other known dinosaur, Baryolestes, an even smaller dinosaur that had sharp teeth, sharp claws, and 2 legs. So clearly a theropod, right? Well, no. What you're seeing is a sauropodomorph that would one day give rise to the giant herbivorous sauropods. But for now, it was a small carnivore, and we know it wasn't a theropod because it had a downward curved jaw tip and a long deltopectoral crest on the humerus, characteristics only seen in sauropodomorphs. But looking at this guy, I admit it's hard to accept. And in general, almost all dinosaurs were like these, viper-like and small, but don't underestimate them because they were quite numerous in a way, since alongside them lived a large number not of dinosaurs but of dinosauriforms, in other words, the second best after dinosaurs. And some of the genera of the time included Lagosuchus, Marasuchus, and Saltopus, which were smaller than their relatives. Derived, and if you saw them in passing, you could mistake them for some strange lizard running on its hind legs. The presence of dinosauromorphs was truly very exciting, and by association, Great news for the archosaurs who were also preparing some things. Besides the terrible lizards, since it was at this stage that some of the most emblematic animals of the late Triassic appear, mainly Rauisuchians, Phytosaurs, Etosaurs, you name it. Probably the Carnian had it, and that also included non-archosaurs as other new faces. They included the oldest Lepidosaurs, which included the ancestor of today's lizards, snakes, and tuataras. Even the first pterosaurids and pterosauromorphs appeared, which were not pterosaurs as you might imagine them, but similar forms that in many cases lacked wings, although they retained structures similar to those of their later descendants. And in the water, things were also cooking with some of the new faces, including the first placodonts, a unique now extinct order of marine reptiles that superficially resembled marine iguanas, and others like turtles with shells, while we also see the appearance in the Carnian of belemnites, an order of squid-like cephalopods that would become an important part of the marine ecosystem until the late Cretaceous, reaching in some cases quite notable sizes, although for now they still had a kawaii size. With all this, you can notice that the Carnian was a time turbulent for life, but all this was just a preview of what was to come. For in the background, things were brewing that would soon have great consequences. For along the western coasts of North America were the enormous flood basalts of Wranghelia, a large igneous province, LIP, that stretched about 2,300 kilometers. And if you're a fan of the channel, you know this means trouble. These provinces are known for bringing chaos enough. Just look at the Permian or Triassic extinctions due to lip eruptions. It was then in the Carnian, 234 million years ago, when Wranghelia erupted, expelling tons of lava and gases, including a gas very famous in modern conversation and technically present in any conversation, carbon dioxide. This LIP, even for its size, released an abnormal amount of CO2 that flooded the ocean atmosphere system, causing global warming between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, the increase in CO2 probably caused an extreme acceleration of the hydrological cycle that basically overloaded continental weathering. And it wasn't just the amount of CO2 released that caused this change, but the speed, since these eruptions were brief but intense, expelling compounds at rates not normally observed. And to make matters worse, it seems that these volcanoes, besides CO2, contained unusual volumes of methane clathrates. Without getting too technical, they are about 86 times more potent than CO2 as greenhouse gases. With this global warming and the acceleration of the hydrological cycle, it began to rain. The Carnian pluvial event had officially started. We don't know, and probably never will know, how intense that rain was, but we can say with certainty that it was raining cats and dogs. Definitely a lot. The rain was so extreme that we even have evidence of it in rock formations where it eroded so much sediment that it exposed the basement rock, normally buried kilometers deep. So it takes a lot of rain erosion to get to this. Other evidence that there was an absurd amount of rain at that time. They also include the abundant presence of amber and certain paleosols that only form when precipitation far exceeds evaporated water. As you know, the ridiculous part wasn't just the amount of rain, but the duration of up to 2 million years of almost continuous rain. Well, saying continuous is a bit dramatic, because despite the cliche that it rained non-stop for 2 million years, it probably wasn't really like that. You would have encountered much higher rates of rain than usual, interspersed with episodes of hyper-extreme precipitation. And the Carnian pluvial event wasn't just about rain. In general, the climate changed drastically from dry to unusually humid. Imagine the wettest, swampiest jungle possible, transforming much of the planet into lush tropical regions, and they would have rivaled the Carboniferous in swampiness, with peat forests re-established. Some other things that became more common during the period were large-scale floodplains and marshes, while there also existed gigantic inland lakes that would make today's Great Lakes look tiny, making this world a certified thalassophobia-inducing one. However, as with almost everything, where you can push, you can pull, and although endless rain was the norm, dryness persisted during the Carnian pluvial event, along with episodes where arid conditions partially returned. Some studies suggest that certain areas were betrayed by this event, becoming more arid than ever. This included nothing less than the driest place in history, the interiors of Pangaea. As mentioned during the early and middle Triassic, these interior regions were practically inhospitable, hot enough to almost cook dinosaurs, and so dry that huge deserts emerged, which ironically worsened with the pluvial event. I doubt anything survived in these extreme pockets. With that clarified, overall we're talking about more than 1 million years of a humid climate and relentless rain for some. This might sound cozy, like that cyberpunk city where it always rains, but in reality the event was less pleasant and rather changed the world, because too much rain messes things up. The pluvial event is considered a forgotten extinction. Since the changes in the environment, global floods, and global warming led to high background extinction rates in fact. Before this rainy period was proposed, scientists already knew that great disappearances had occurred during the Carnian. They just didn't know why, and now they know. Surprisingly, although underwater you don't feel the rain, it seems that marine life was the hardest hit. One hypothesis suggests that the pluvial event altered the oceans by reducing their carbonate platforms, severely damaging the animals. Carbonate builders, which led to the disappearance of many conodonts, ammonoids, and bryozoans, while algae and crinoids also suffered greatly. There is evidence that the rains were even sufficient to dilute the salinity of the ocean, which for you and me would not be noticeable. But for certain marine animals, it would have been torturous, altering their homeostasis and adding to the high extinction rate. On land, the situation was less severe, but it remained complicated. Since there were some animals that had difficulties dealing with the floods, the rain, and the transformation of the environment, one of the main groups affected was one that I already briefly mentioned, rhynchosaurs. They were herbivores of the clade Archosauromorpha, meaning they were more closely related to archosaurs than to lepidosaurs, and they appeared in the early days of the Triassic, quickly achieving success and becoming quite abundant in certain parts of Pangaea, sometimes representing 40 to 60% of all specimens in a formation. And at the beginning of the Carnian, they could not have been better. Originally, they were small and lizard-like in appearance, but later reached lengths of up to 2 m, and they became more robust while their faces lengthened and became more triangular. Everything seemed to be going better for them, but the Carnian pluvial event had other plans, and the rhynchosaurs were absolutely punished during those years. The main idea is that they could not keep up with the change in the forests as their preferred vegetation became scarcer, and virtually all families disappeared except one, but the pedentine and even these did not last much longer, disappearing in the next stage. So they had plenty of reasons to hate the rain. The same happened to the dinosaurs. This group needs no introduction. It has given us iconic animals like plesiosaurs or lystrosaurs. But to refresh, it was a very diverse group of non-mammalian theropods. They were herbivores and usually had fangs, hence their name meaning 2 canines. They existed since the Permian, and like the rhynchosaurs, they were doing well, but for similar reasons they found themselves in trouble during the pluvial event, and many of the groups alive at that time ended up going extinct. Still, they fared a little better than the dinosaurs, persisting somewhat longer thanks to their greater diversity. Although they finally disappeared about 211 million years ago, the curious thing about the Carnian pluvial event is that, although background extinction rates were abnormally high at that time, I would dare to say that more animals and organisms have to thank it, since many ways of life received boosters. Thanks to it, including of course the greatest lovers of rain, plants and trees. As the lands moved away from the arid paradigm, the flora began a strong resurgence, with forests and swamps sprouting all over the world. And it was then that ferns, conifers, and benedictales diversified intensively. The level reached by the forests, as well as the rise of inland lakes and lush environments, ended up having a beneficial impact on several creatures, including the future powerful rulers of the earth, the dinosaurs. Yes, apparently this rainy episode was an essential step in their development, as diversification rate, and size increased enormously. The overall abundance of dinosaurs also increased during the Carnian pluvial event. Formations went from containing a couple of dinosaur genera to almost 10 inches some cases. One of the best examples of this is the Ishigualasto Formation in Argentina, which had at least 8 different types of dinosaurs, including multiple sauropodomorphs and hereracerids. Among them was even Herrerasaurus, one of the largest predatory dinosaurs of the entire Triassic, with specimens up to 6 meters long and large serrated teeth that allowed them to hunt a wide range of vertebrates in their environment, also becoming one of the most common carnivores in that ecosystem. More than 50 specimens have been recovered. Other specific genera included Aeoraptor edromeus, Antivus panphagia, and Sanjuanosaurus, the latter not much smaller than Herrerasaurus. Furthermore, it is only after this event that we also see the rise of the first giant dinosaurs. So during the Norian, 228 million years ago, Lesiomosaurus appears. It is one of the largest Triassic dinosaurs, a sauropod that measured 12 m in length and possibly weighed up to 10 tons. Close to the record weight of an African elephant, so it's not much compared to other sauropods from the Jurassic and Cretaceous, but impressive. Anyway, you must remember that the Triassic was not the golden age of dinosaurs. There were other more prominent groups that also received their own boosts after the CPE. This largely involved etosaurs, which became some of the most dominant land animals, and were more archosaurs. They were more closely related to crocodiles than to birds and dinosaurs. It's easy to call this group a strange bunch at first glance. They look like medium to large armored creatures, similar to crocodiles, but they were actually terrestrial and usually herbivorous or omnivorous non-predators. And they seem to have benefited greatly from the new forests that emerged. They were able to specialize better in conifers and ferns, unlike earlier orders like rhynchosaurs, another big winner. It was a somewhat close relative of etosaurs, though a bit more bloodthirsty. Phytosaurs. It's not hard to imagine why a group of semi-aquatic carnivores would thrive after a lot of rain. The rise of swamps and megalakes was the equivalent for phytosaurs of inhaling aromatic salts. Very quickly they diversified, expanding their distribution and growing in size, becoming quite large, such that almost anything, including some sauropods, had to be alert when approaching to drink. Fresh water, and I know we all have to drink, but I don't need much to keep me away from giant lakes. And although not to the same extent, it seems that turtles and crocodilomorphs also progressed, diversifying further. So who knows, perhaps thanks to a downpour 234 million years ago, we have crocodiles and turtles today, of course. I can't talk about a Triassic event without mentioning how the true ones fared. Land rulers in terms of predators. The Rauisuchians, a diverse group of archosaurs, usually quadrupedal and terrifying, with sinister jaws, armor, and possibly a bad temper, they had already become established. As the dominant predators at that time, they were found practically worldwide, almost always at the apex of their ecosystems. However, despite their powerful status, like all animals, they were affected by the CPE. But what kind of changes the pluvial event caused them is something ambiguous. There is debate about the extent of its influence, with some saying that even if it hadn't occurred, it wouldn't change the timeline of the Rauisuchians much. Although that said, there are some interesting things that have been observed in this group, and the timing of the event to begin with. Although Rauisuchians had been quite diverse throughout much of the late Triassic, a good portion of genera only appeared during the Carnian, and more specifically around or just after the prolonged rain. Furthermore, although they were always creatures of decent size, it seems their body size increased only after the rain. This could be a mere coincidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. And it was bad news for all life in the Norian. Well, we start to see genera like Saurosuchus, a giant 7 m long and half a ton in weight, while the even larger Fossolosuchus also appears only after the Carnian, though much later. And although it may be that these changes were not linked to the Carnian pluvial episode, I think it's fair to say that 2 million years of rain had a big impact on the planet and changed its course forever. Which leaves one more question. What happened next? Well, finally, like everything, the volcanoes stopped erupting and the rain slowly decreased, giving way again to the arid, dry, and hot conditions that we know so well. However, although in some aspects things returned to normal, the effects of the Carnian pluvial event were long-lasting, since the changes undergone by the animals would end up leading directly or indirectly to certain results that would be seen later. So the next time it rains, I want you to remember this video and thank the rain for perhaps creating crocodiles and turtles. And thank you for watching this video. Here are others that might interest you.